With the next trailer for Ascendance likely somewhere within a week to a month away, we might soon be getting our first look at the expansion's flagship. This reveal is actually fairly late as far as recent expansions go. Malzeno was revealed in the initial teaser for Sunbreak, and while Velkhana technically only made its debut in the second Iceborne trailer, this was at the end of the first actual gameplay trailer, functionally the equivalent of our Ascendance debut, complete with biome, monster, and gameplay revelations. Whether the reveal is around the corner, or if we'll be waiting until the fourth major trailer like with base game Flagships, Arkveld, and Nergigante, remains to be seen, but we still have some principles to speculate around. Given Wilds' sustained love affair with Monster Hunter 4 and 4 Ultimate, I have seen some musings that the flagship of the expansion could be a demi-elder. This claim makes sense in some ways. Gormagala was the flagship of Monster Hunter 4, while Seregios, a flying wyvern, was the flagship of 4U, with base Wilds' own flying wyvern flagship and the formal introduction of demi-elder as a category, ripe for expansion beyond our favourite flying contagion. This idea definitely has potential weight. However, more than the type of potential flagship, we actually have more concrete criteria to work with in predicting the shape of our latest flagship, Arkveld herself. Modern expansion flagships are notable in that they are often explicitly designed to contrast the flagships of the base games, in everything from themes to silhouette to abilities to movement style. This is true for World and Iceborne, and for Rise and Sunbreak. It may also be true for older titles, although information there is harder to come by, at least from the sources that I have access to. Nonetheless, precedent set by modern generation titles is pattern enough to work with, so that's what we'll be exploring and drawing on here. Good day everyone. This is Laraika Laray, your local gaming academic, and today I'm going to do some speculation around the theme and design philosophy of flagships broadly, and Ascendance's flagship specifically. I wanted to get this out in advance of Gamescom just in case it drops in a trailer there, in part because I am curious how right and how wrong I'm going to be. Chances are very wrong. Regardless, I thought it was going to be fun to talk about the contrasting design philosophy of flagships in recent games. First, I'm going to talk about the design decisions behind previous flagship pairings, Nergigante and Velkhana, and Magnamalo and Malzeno, and then I'll talk a bit about what we know and can infer from Arkveld's design. From this, I'm going to draw up a few themes and principles that Ascendance's flagship might, and I stress, might, adhere to. So if that sounds like fun, please like, subscribe, sit back, and relax. Outlining the design parallels and contrasts between Rise's Magnamalo and Sunbreak's Malzeno is one of the more simple tasks here, because this work was already done for us by Malzeno's designer herself, Shin Ewa, in an interview with Shibata Koichi published on November 30th, 2022. Here, Shin discusses the core elements that went into the flagship's design, highlighting the initial concept of vampire, and how she integrated aspects of a noble and a knight into the design, such as the Kyuryo Jabo and the silver scales, as well as more traditional draconic aspects drawing on the etymology of Dracula as son of the dragon, which is just a fun piece of etymology if you don't know it. The interview is really fantastic, and I suggest checking it out, link in the description. The part I want to focus on here, however, is the part when Shin discusses how she designed Malzeno specifically in contrast to the base game's flagship Magnamalo. Responding to Shibata's question about the core themes of Malzeno's design, Shin states, "We were also very aware of the contrast we wanted it to have with Magnamalo. Eastern versus Western, Tiger versus Dragon, Samurai versus Knight, Dark versus Bright. The most notable feature of this contrast is its face. We started out with a bat-like design, and we considered laying it on thick by giving it a creepy creature vibe, but we ended up with something more sophisticated. So you've got the rugged appearance of Magnamalo on one end, and the sharp, clean-cut features of Malzeno on the other. This doesn't just go for their motifs and colouring, but for their personalities as well. Magnamalo is wild and brutish, whereas Malzeno is shrewd and elegant. Magnamalo represents strength, Malzeno represents intelligence. We were very thorough in exploring this contrast. In a later section, she also discusses the contrast in their movement when explaining Malzeno's seeming capacity to teleport. Malzeno's movement was designed to contrast with Magnamalo's movement as well, with Magnamalo kicking the ground to dash forward, and Malzeno thrusting forward as if being pushed. You could say that Magnamalo's explosion effects and Malzeno's wave motion effects are in contrast with each other as well. Sheen makes clear in the interview that Malzeno's power to seemingly teleport is drawn from the energy of the Curio, and while she doesn't touch on this, I can't help but find a contrast here fun for symbolic reasons. Magnamalo, which pursues the rampage, moves through a rappelling off the ground, a leap of forward momentum and pursuit, whereas Malzeno is thrust forward as if pushed. It is framed not as the actor, but the acted upon, which is a fitting analogy for its fraught symbiosis with the parasitic Curio. Thematic movements aside, we see here how the wild brutish strength of Magnamalo is deliberately contrasted by Malzeno, which is elegant, shrewd, cunning, and intelligent, traits befitting of a vampire. The interview doesn't discuss these points, but I also find it interesting that the pair are contrasted in terms of ecological movement as well. Magnamalo is somewhat nomadic, following the rampage in order to feed, whereas Malzeno seems to be highly territorial, patrolling the ruined citadel and becoming infested through the act of fending off the intruder Geismacorn. They also show an interesting similarity in their core design inspirations. Malzeno is a vampire, Magnamalo is a possessed suit of samurai armor. Both draw inspirations on the undead, and they are actually not alone here, although that's a topic for later. World and Iceborne followed a similar design philosophy, and while we don't have quite as pithy a summary for the contrast between Velkhana and Nergigante, at least in sources I have access to, we can draw broader contrasts between their themes and designs, which are separately discussed quite at length. The core conceptual design of Nergigante was based on the theme of destruction and regeneration, manifested in the final design through its regenerating spikes. This, combined with the concept of a raw damage dealer, a kind of heavyweight brawler elder dragon that contrasted the more supernatural powers of elders like Kushala and Teostra. This was an idea that was iterated on several times in the design process. In an interview with Game Informer, Fujioka Kaname states, "Our initial concept, based on the regeneration idea, was that it would have these limbs and wings that would be growing out spikily as they regenerate and are destroyed. The reason we didn't proceed with this design was that it didn't give us enough of a sense of the cycle that's going to repeat throughout the battle, where it's going to be destruction and regeneration recurring over and over." Fujioka and the other developers went through a couple of designs. The second had the core spike motif, but it was too alien in its appearance. It lacked the grounded quality signature to the franchise, so ultimately they honed in on the final design. The design went more in the direction that it's going to be very powerful and have destructive power, and we decided that it was going to be very front-loaded, that it was going to have these very powerful forelimbs, and that the front of its body would be where it counts. Fujioka then explains that the extreme spikiness arose specifically to give the monster a more distinctive silhouette, one that factored into the theme and the fight and elevated the concept beyond basically just a lizard. The weapons and armor re-emphasized these core design elements by stressing what he calls the barbaric wild nature of the monster, as well as its squat profile, overall strength, and demonic appearance. This leads into designs such as the dual blades, which are more akin to savage claws, and the close-cropped, almost sawn-off shotgun feel of the bowguns. We see here the process that gave birth to the core concepts of Nergigante, a being of raw power honed through endless cycles of destruction and renewal. This is also manifested in its lore, as the reproductive cycle of, say, Shigaru Magala is tied to its signature frenzy virus. Nergigante's is tied to its regeneration. Exposed to significant amounts of energy, the cells in Nergigante's spikes adopt a reproductive capacity, dividing and redividing in a manner that might ultimately give birth to another member of the species. It is hypothesized by a researcher quoted in the lore book that this might be why it seems to home in on Zoromagdaros, requiring the excessive surplus bioenergy that the Elder Dragon contains, specifically for this form of reproductive regeneration. If Nergigante's core concept was destruction and rebirth, however, Velkhana's was simply ice. But this is also notable here. Ice is associated with stasis, it fixes things in place. Immediately this creates contrast, stasis versus flow, fixedness versus fluidity, the slow immobility of all things against the endless cycles of death and rebirth. Velkhana's shape was also influenced by a desire to contrast not simply Nergigante, but the robust broadness of many other elders, as Fujioka outlines in another interview for Game Informer. We wanted to envision an elegant monster, and kind of envisioned it having a bird wingspan, but we wanted to make sure that the general shape and silhouette of the Elder Dragon this time around was very different from previous Elders. Because it has a high affinity toward ice, we wanted to sharpen up the edges and make sure that's much more well defined, as well as having more of a whip-like tail. Indeed, one of the early concept arts for Velkhana has it as far more distinctly bird-like than its final design, a decision likely made to differentiate it from World's primary ice wyvern Legiana, which is very bird-like. But this element did continue to influence its design. In a note on the Velkhana concept art from Monster Hunter Festa 2019 to 2020, currently only available through the Wayback Machine, link in the description, its designer notes that something flowery, feathery, and bejeweled was the order for this one. While we were trying to make it look more feminine, I showed the equipment and the armor designer asked, "This frost on its nose? Is it snot?" Which made me laugh. I drew it as a male monster, but I suppose Elder Dragons would transcend those kinds of definitions. Jewels, flowers, and feathers set across the spelt design here serve as an immediate contrast to the top-heavy, spine-covered Nergigante. And indeed, the base flagship serves as the primary foil to the expansions. In the Iceborne Complete works, Fujioka outlines how Velkhana was designed to be more mage-like, in contrast to the brutish Nergigante. He here evokes the image of a witch, beautiful at first glance but hiding deadly power. Yet, as he explains in the Game Informer piece, we didn't want it to be defined as, oh, it's able to use these ice attacks by performing magic. We didn't want that kind of characteristic. We wanted it to be grounded in some level of believability. We bounced a bunch of different ideas amongst ourselves, and what we ultimately chanced upon was the idea of supercooling, where liquid immediately turns to a solid under certain conditions. We felt that it would be a very interesting concept to base an Elder Dragon on, so we went with that specific direction. Again, it's grounded a little more in believability, but executing these almost magic-like attacks. As an addendum here, I find this really interesting not just as a design element of Velkhana's conception, but also because of some potential ramifications this might actually have for Ascendance, or at least for the lore of the Eastlands. If one pays close attention to the Wyverian technology on the Ice Shard Cliffs, it becomes clear that the frost winds are in fact caused by coolant used for the vast Kagome lattice superconductor magnets in the walls, which is leaking out due to the severe infrastructural damage. I've spoken in previous videos about how each inclemency may have had a template elder from which Wyveria derived its technology. Biomimicry, the process of taking inspiration from nature for technology, is a fairly solid strategy even in our own world, and I think it's possible that Velkhana's super cool water may have been a potential basis for Wyveria's coolant technology here. Should the Iceborne Wyvern return in Ascendance, we may actually get some answers to this. But if not, or if we get no compelling competing information, this is probably going to remain as my headcanon for the foreseeable future. We see in Rise and Sunbreak and World and Iceborne how the expansion's flagships are designed explicitly and implicitly in contrast to the base game flagships. Velkhana is the elegant ice mage and fencer who freezes all in place, in contrast to the squat bodybuilder posture, raw damage, and the endless regeneration of Nergigante, a dragon which rebalances the ecosystem through its predation of vast quantities of bioenergy. Malzeno is the cunning, intelligent vampire to Magnamalo's barbaric beast, the dragon to its tiger, the staunch defender of territory even to the point of its own infestation, to the latter's ravenous and haunting prowler, taking advantage of surplus energy brought forth by the rampage. Both are undead horrors, but while one remains ensconced in its ruined castle, the latter stalks old battlefields, a lingering grudge following after the army to prey on its stragglers and its dead. Given these precedents, however, what might we expect from Ascendance's flagship? What might we see emerge to contrast Arkveld, the White Wraith? So, the first place to start here is with Arkveld's core design motifs. Although at the time of writing we lack a comprehensive interview going over Arkveld's design, we can garner a lot from a combination of press releases, concept art, supplementary material, and just general observations. In the Monster Hunter Festa 2026 booklet, kindly uploaded by the community member Zugzwang, Arkveld's designer describes Arkveld as a bleak monster with an unyielding will. A design that is reinforced through the image of both chains and ghosts. The designer continues that the crumbling carapace is intended to convey a sense of both chainmail and defossilization, figuring Arkveld as the reversal of an extinct species, its carapace cracking as if it's emerging from stone. This framing reflects earlier design notes seen in the 2025 Monster Hunter Orchestral booklet, kindly posted to Twitter by Kinokashi. This text contains entries from both composer Akiyuki Morimoto and director Yuya Tokuda, and while they chiefly reflect on Arkveld's musical themes, they also reveal some underlying design principles. Discussing Radiant Cry of Life, the theme of Guardian Arkveld, Morimoto explains that the synthetic bass elements represent the chains of fate which bind Arkveld, while the violin embodies its will to resist them. I really like this, especially since in another interview Morimoto defines the synthetic noise as the defining sound of the Forbidden Lands, hence its use in the core motifs of the Inclemencies. This musically links Arkveld's chains to the structure of the Eastlands itself, its underlying artificiality that formed the backdrop of the bonds of fate against which she struggles. This desire for resistance and freedom is reinforced by the theme Ashen Blade Unleashed, which Morimoto states attempts to capture the beauty of living life on one's own terms. Director Tokuda echoes these sentiments, discussing how Arkveld's theme carries an underlying anger, and how the strings seek to convey the monster's core emotions of sadness and rage, at the same time as the percussion echoes its heartbeat, reflecting Arkveld's joy and attachment to life. The framings put forward here by the developers contextualize what we see of Arkveld in-game. The equating of her carapace to chainmail reinforces a martial quality. Other than in her eventual breakdown in Wyveria, we are chiefly shown her preying on apex monsters, Uthduna and Raydal, attributes which give her a sense of a powerful and initially honourable warrior who ultimately succumbs to her own madness. Alongside the heavy deployment of chains, I would argue that Arkveld draws here upon the iconography of the enslaved gladiator. The trope of an enslaved gladiator who rebels is a fairly old one in media, with cinematic depictions, as seen in movies like Gladiator, harkening back to the classic 1970s movie Spartacus, itself dramatizing the life of a Thracian gladiator who led a slave revolt against the Roman Republic during the 1st century BCE. In more explicitly fantasy settings, this trope is also seen within sword and sorcery characters like Conan the Barbarian, a figure associated with the fantasy Northern European realm of Hyperborea, the land beyond the North Winds. Arkveld's head is part of this image, taking on the appearance of a curved horned helmet. While it lacks much historical accuracy, the horned helmet is an iconic part of the fantasy Viking aesthetic, one of the most famous gaming examples being the iron helm worn by the Dragonborn in Skyrim. This fantastical Viking gladiator style aesthetic is carried into Arkveld's weapons and armor, which are adorned with Celtic knot-style designs and voluminous fur, in addition to the persistent motif of heavy chains. Read in a more Celtic-Nordic context, this actually gives Arkveld the qualities perhaps not only of a ghost, but maybe more specifically of a Draugr, the revenants that are said to haunt burial mounds in Norse-inspired cultures across the medieval world. While Draugr today are most famous from being dime a dozen enemies in Elder Scrolls V, their history in Icelandic and other Nordic-inspired cultures is actually a pretty interesting one. Their modern reputation as Norse zombies is not wholly unearned. Howard Williams, in his work on death and burial in medieval Britain, describes Draugr as a corporeal ghost. That is, it had a body. It was not merely a spectre. The Draugr was a pale corpse, blue or deadly white, possessed of a singular envy or greed of the living, and an immense and unquenchable appetite. It could often only be stopped through the destruction of its reanimated body. I would say that our White Wraith is actually fairly similar in this regard. Corpse pale, with a blue mouth, a ghost rattling its chains, she stalks the burial mounds of Old Wyveria, possessed by insatiable hunger and the burning desire for a new life. It's interesting, given Wilds is following on from Rise and Sunbreak here, that Arkveld also has something of the undead in her. I'm sure critics of the modern gen games will find something to say here about the history of the franchise. Stepping back from the specificities of Arkveld's design, however, we can also see that she shares a lot of her qualities with more recent base game flagships like Nergigante and Magnamalo. Arkveld is a bulky and brutal close-quarters combatant. We might thus infer that Ascendance's flagship might draw on a similar pull to Velkhana and Malzeno, pushing for a more elegant silhouette and qualities closer to cunning or subterfuge or magical-seeming environmental denial over raw power and aggression. Perhaps a sense of trickery and free-flowing movement, almost opportunism, to counter her sense of indomitable will and relentless forward momentum. Setting this aside, however, I think a more notable contrast will probably be in colour. Arkveld is deliberately bleak in her design, evoking a washed-out ghost laden with chains. Her palette is whites and greys speckled with black and blue. If Arkveld's visual design evokes a deathly spectre, Ascendance's flagship might push towards the opposite attributes, representing vibrancy and life, iridescence, and awash with colour. The setting change oriented towards the sky also permits a flagship that focuses on freedom, qualities that Arkveld arguably attains at the end of her journey, although the Arch-Tempered's return to her species' site of origin might cast some doubt on this, but which nonetheless are not a core aspect of her artistic design. I think it's worth noting here that I definitely think the flagship of Ascendance is going to be an Elder Dragon, or perhaps drawing on 4 and 4U parallels, a Demi-Elder. Mainly this is due to the telegraphed importance of Elder Dragons to Ascendance's story. It makes sense for the flagship to be an Elder Dragon at some varied stage of its life. But Elder Dragons in general are also a popular flagship monster, especially in modern gen games. That said, if I was personally asked to design a flagship specifically to contrast Arkveld, without other considerations, I would probably go for an Elder Dragon in the shape of either a bird wyvern or a flying snake wyvern like Ramobra. Birds and serpents would be able to capture the elegant streamlined silhouette in opposition to Arkveld's, while also figuring a sense of life and liberation. Birds, as mentioned, are a common symbol of constraint and freedom, something the game deliberately invokes in its low-rank ending. Serpents, meanwhile, are common cultural symbols of rebirth, immortality, and creation, themes that contrast Arkveld's design while paralleling her themes. This is a trope the franchise itself has evoked with Shah de Lamada, whose weapons tell the story of its creation of the world, a concept likely drawn from the image of the Orphic egg, a topic for another day. The mythological history of feathered or skyboard serpents is also a rich one to tap for potential inspiration, from Quetzalcoatl and his kin in Mesoamerica, to the rainbow serpent of Australian Aboriginal beliefs, to Danbala and Aedowedo of West African beliefs. Many of these figures have strong associations with the sky, life, creation, beauty, and the rainbow, setting the stage for an immediate thematic and aesthetic contrast to our beloved yet beleaguered Arkveld. Now, I love snakes almost as much as I love cephalopods, so I obviously have a bias here. But even without serpentine aspects, avian ones would also serve as a solid contrast for similar reasons, provided the bird wyvern or bird wyvern-like elder in question goes more Malfestio and less Yankutku. Beyond the capacity for vibrant plumes, birds, like cephalopods, are notoriously intelligent, setting the thematic stage for a fight that could rely more on technicality and trickery than on more straightforward combat. I do suspect that Ascendance will be broadly safe and go for something winged and resolutely on theme. Birds are a core motif of Wilds in general, from the legend of Sumult, the protective wings of the player hunter, to the symbolism of Arkveld striving for freedom. A bird like Elder Dragon or Demi-Elder would work really well here, and is something I am actually surprised we haven't seen yet. Although I guess that Velkhana's initial designs are actually pretty close, even though they were ultimately scaled back in favour of the more lithe reptilian form we ended up with. But maybe it's time for a proper griffin to finally grace the franchise. So yeah, in summary, a bird or bird serpent like Elder Dragon with a lithe silhouette, bright vibrant coloration, and a focus on more zoning and trickster-like abilities in gameplay. A symbol of creation and freedom, not of manufacture and constraint. A being that soars rather than skulks, awash with iridescence and power, rather than a drained and draining haunter in the dark, yearning for release. Now, I am thoroughly expecting to be wrong here, and honestly I would kind of love to be because it would give me more to think about. I can't wait to talk about how the design of the flagship and of Arkveld contrast once we actually know it. All of my videos are just creative expressions of my thoughts and what research I am able to conduct on the topics I talk about, but I am not an authority here. Regardless of my personal feelings, however, developer statements about other recent flagships suggest that being a contrast to Arkveld is at the very least going to be a core part of Ascendance's flagship's design dark, likely down to the abilities it has, a la Velkhana, and even the style of movement, a la Malzeno. Although I admit the latter is so subtle, it's pretty easy to miss. The developer comments we have available suggest that the core attributes of Arkveld's design are her willpower and her sense of haunting, her bleakness, her ghostly chains, her crumbling chainmail carapace, and, taken together, her refusal to be only a creature of the past, to relentlessly push her way into the present. As much as Malzeno and the other two lords in Sunbreak were directly inspired by classics of gothic fiction like vampires, werewolves, and Frankenstein's monster, these qualities mark Arkveld as much a creature of the gothic as they are. She is a warrior trapped on the brink of undeath, her armor at once crumbling away and representing her rejection of her own extinction, her fossilization, indomitably pushing forward, dragging her chains like a corporeal spectre. What kind of creature do you think could stand in contrast to such a being? Thank you all for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video, please like and leave a comment, and if you want to see more of my content, consider subscribing. And if you would like to support this channel financially, consider becoming a member for early access to all videos and your name in the credits. We have now passed 1,000 subscribers, which I continue to be baffled by. Like I said, I wanted to get this out before Gamescom, which runs from the 24th to the 30th of August, and is very likely where we'll be getting our next trailer. The next week after this is likely to be my 1,000 subscriber Q&A video, which will be dropping on the 24th. If we do get a trailer that week, I'm also going to be posting my initial blind reaction to it, with a more in-depth video to follow on the 31st. If we do not get a trailer, I have some other videos in the works already that I hope you will enjoy. And on that note, I hope you have a good week. Love and solidarity to you all. This has been Laraika Laray, signing off.
Did I go and burst the bubble? Promise more than I can give. I tried to touch its cosmic sheen, but today all I smell is chlorine. Yesterday I